This is a lens that people are calling the new King of Bokeh. But to understand this lens, we kind of got to talk about the original King of Bokeh. And that was a lens made by Carl Zeiss. It was called the Biotar 75mm f1.5. And it was released back in 1938. And it had specific image character that is desirable today, used on both cinema cameras and mirrorless cameras alike. And people have been just adapting this lens for years. And because of its popularity, the price had gone to above $3,000 for a good copy of this lens. And the very specific image traits that it had that people were after were, first of all, it had this swirly bokeh effect. And people are right now in love with this swirly bokeh effect. And this lens gave the most swirly bokeh of pretty much any lens that you could buy. The other thing it gave you was what would be called a sweet spot effect, which is you had a sharp center of frame with softer edges and image corners, allowing you to put something in the middle of the frame and isolate that subject. And even if something on the side of the frame was the same distance away, it would be blurred out because of this sweet spot effect. The other thing it gave you was this 3D pop that people are all obsessed with. And that's where the thing that is sharp and in the center of image almost jumps out of the screen at you, giving you this 3D look to your images. And even though this is an amazing lens, it's $3,000 and it comes with many of the disadvantages that you get with all vintage lenses. And that includes dust inside and on the elements, discoloring or degrading of the lens coatings, lens fungus, problem with the gearing, oil on the aperture blades, all kinds of things that you're going to get. You might get this kind of project lens and you still can pay up to $3,000 for a good copy. Now, this lens is designed to fix all that. Now, in full disclosure, this lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself. The company had no say in the making of the video, and this is not a paid or sponsored video. This is the new release lens by TTArtisan. It's a 75mm f1.5, and it seems to be a reasonable facsimile of that Biotar lens, or actually a reproduction of that lens. I'm not sure which. And because of that, it gives you a very similar set of image traits, but you're paying 10% of the price, and you're not getting all those pitfalls that you get with vintage lenses. At the time of shooting this video, I can only find it available at 2 different retailers, so I'll put those links in the description down below. It's a fairly niche lens, so I don't think it's going to be widely available, so I will keep those links updated with the places that you can actually buy it right now. Now, before you invest in this lens, there's some optical traits I want to talk about, because using this lens is actually quite different than probably just about any lens I've ever used, and depending on what aperture you use, the characteristics of the lens change quite dramatically. Now, first of all, when you shoot this lens wide open at f1.5 or even slightly stop down to f2, what you're going to get is a very narrow sweet spot in the center of the image, which is going to be clear and detailed and in focus. Once you get outside of that sweet spot, everything else is blurry and out of focus. It doesn't matter if it is actually in the plane of focus. Those edges of frame just never become clear. What this allows you to do is put something in the center of the frame, draw the viewer's eye to that, get that sharp and detailed and in focus, and then everything around it falls off into a blurry mess. At these apertures, f1.5 to f2 is also where you get the swirly bokeh effect. Once we stop it down a little bit, we start to very quickly lose that swirly bokeh effect. So once we've got this lens stopped down to f2.8, we've got a larger sweet spot, but we've actually lost the swirly bokeh effect in the background for the most part. So we've got a little bit more room to work with in the center of frame, but the swirly bokeh is gone. But that swirly bokeh is replaced by soft, round bubble bokeh, which has a nice light outlining around the edges of the bubble bokeh balls, but it also has a very clean center. You've got no spots or onion ringing or anything like that. This is another point that I should point out the advantages of buying a new lens when we look at the bubble bokeh effect to a vintage lens, because a vintage lens that has some dust inside and sitting on the elements, you will actually see in those bokeh circles or bokeh balls, you will actually see little specks and dots, and it will create kind of a texture in there. So having a new lens without those dust issues is going to give you bokeh balls which are nice and clean. Now, once we stop it down to f4, down to between f4 and 8 and on, we get a very sharp image across the frame, and we have now lost that sweet spot effect. So from f4 on, across the frame, you're going to get a lot of sharpness, but you are also going to still maintain that bubble bokeh effect, And given it's a 75mm lens, depending on the distance you are to your subject, you still are going to be able to get quite out of focus backgrounds with these round circular bokeh balls, which form a nice backdrop for whatever you've got in focus in the frame. And the other thing you're going to notice is shooting wide open at f1.5, you're going to get a reasonable amount of vignette, which I think that can be seen as an image character flaw, vignette, but in this case, since we've got these out of focus corners and we're trying to draw the viewer's eye to the thing that's in the center of frame in the sweet spot, having a darkening of the edges and the outlining of the frame, I actually think is a good thing. And if it wasn't giving this reasonably heavy vignette, I would almost certainly add it in editing, which is almost what I do with all of my portrait photos, or where I've got something in the center frame that I'm really trying to get pop out. So without any editing whatsoever, you really are drawing the viewer's eye to the thing that is in the center of frame. Now, just like the original Biotar, this is an all metal lens. It is a manual focus lens with manual focus, manual aperture, and the thing is incredibly well built. And you look at it, it's just got this huge, beautiful front element. And in many ways, it really feels very similar to the original Biotar lens. It has a clicked aperture ring, which is something that I prefer, and it has a very smooth focus ring, and it has a reasonable throw on that focus ring, which I find just perfect for nailing focus. And I'll say I never had any trouble nailing focus. The focus ring is very smooth, and you've got enough movement. The one thing you do need to be aware of is when you are focusing, make sure you're focusing in the middle of frame and you don't reposition, particularly when you're shooting wide open, because often what I'll do is like, okay, I'll use the center of frame to nail that focus, and then I'll reposition to actually change the composition of the image. But you won't necessarily know that that thing is in focus, because once it moves out of that sweet spot, if you're shooting wide open, it's actually going to be out of focus. So I had no trouble nailing focus, but that's something you just have to be aware of when you're shooting. Make sure that you're looking at the thing in the middle of frame or wherever you're focusing, and don't reposition after you nail focus. And while we're looking at the build of the lens, I should point out that it is an M42 screw mount lens, just like the traditional Biotar lens. And because of that, it can be used adapted on any modern mirrorless camera. Now, we'll put some links in the description down below to the adapters that I recommend, because not all adapters are created equal, and I bought some cheap ones that were absolute bombs. You don't have to spend a fortune, but if you get one screw mount adapter, you're gonna be able to use that for years and years and years. It's never gonna expire, never gonna go out of date. So spending an extra 20 bucks to get a good adapter is absolutely well worth it. The other impressive thing about this lens is the fact that it shows little to no distortion whatsoever. I mean, the lines are almost perfectly straight, which I think isn't too hard with a lens at a 75mm focal length maybe, but they really did nail that, and it's a reasonably simple optical design. So to nail that perfect or near perfect distortion performance with a very simple lens design, I think is pretty impressive. Talking about chromatic aberration in focus areas. That means we've got something wide open, center of frame, in focus, like a test chart. There is basically no color fringing or little or no color fringing. It is dead on. And I would say in focus areas, the chromatic aberration is virtually non-existent, or so little that it doesn't matter in real world results. And this is where we get kind of interesting results, because if you have something in the center of frame and you're focused on it, you're not going to get chromatic aberration there, but you can have something that is in that same plane of focus just outside the center of frame, and you are going to get reasonably heavy color fringing if you're shooting wide open. So this is just something to be aware of. It just gives it this kind of dreamy effect. The other place this lens was really impressive was the flare performance. Given it's a TTArtisan's lens, and this is not one of their strongest things is flare coatings in the past, and given it's based on a vintage lens, I expect the flare performance to be terrible. It was actually really, really good. And when it did flare, I thought it looked really nice and cinematic and artistic. And so I really liked the flare performance on the lens. In fact, I probably would have been disappointed if the lens didn't flare at all. So it does flare a bit. It flares in a way that I think is really nice and really artistic. And so I think it's pretty much a perfect flare performance if you're looking for a little bit of an artistic look in your flare. Looking at close-up image quality, the close-up image quality is great. Now, the minimum focus distance isn't very close. You have to get a little bit further away than I would prefer, But when you do that, the images are very sharp and detailed, and there isn't any degradation in the image quality or sharpness when you use that minimum focus distance. And you can use it a couple of different ways. You can either put something small in that center sweet spot of the lens, just have everything obliterated and blurry sitting around it, which gives you a very cool effect. Or you can stop it down a bit, and when you do, you will still get nice, pleasing out of focus areas. As you stop it down, you can get that bubble bokeh effect as well, because you got a sharp and detailed image. So you can shoot it at f1.5, you've got great image there, or you can shoot it at f4, f5.6, and you're gonna get great images there, just with a little bit different character between them. Now, the thing I really like about this lens is it effectively is a 2 lenses in one. At f1.5 and f2, you've got a sweet spot effect where you put something in the center frame, focus on it, and everything else is going to be blurry and out of focus. You're also going to get this incredibly swirly bokeh effect, which is going to swirl around the thing in the center frame and really draw the viewer's eye to that. Once you stop down to f4, you essentially have a bubble bokeh lens. And at f4, because this is a 75mm lens, you can still get an out of focus area. You can shoot full-length portraits. There's a number of different things that you can do with a lens even at f4. But I think if the main thing you're after is a bubble bokeh portrait style lens, then I think this might be the better lens for you. This is TTArtisan's remake of a famous bubble bokeh lens, and that is a super fun lens as well. And it's also an M42 screw mount lens, so you can adapt it to any modern mirrorless camera.